December 21st, 1968. The shortest day of the year, but in significance, perhaps one of the longest in the flow of history.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control. We are still go at this time. T-minus 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. The engines are armed. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit. We have liftoff. Liftoff at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We have cleared the top.
Tower clear, 13 seconds.
The United States was undertaking the most distant voyage ever attempted by man. For the first time, 3 Americans rode the Saturn V moon rocket.
Following Houston, you are go for staging, over. Staging. Complete, Sep. Roger, understand, Sep. We hear you loud and clear, Apollo 8.
Okay, the first stage was very smooth, and this one is smoother.
Apollo 8 Houston, your trajectory and guidance are go, over.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, you're looking real good, Frank.
Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders were about to leave their cradle Earth and face the infinite frontier.
Apollo 8 Houston.
Go ahead, Houston.
Apollo 8, you are go for TLI, over.
Roger, understand. We're go for TLI.
TLI, Translunar Insertion. This was the commitment. Borman, Lovell, and Anders were ready for the maneuver that would send them to the moon. As the world listened and watched, its people were overtaken by a new awareness, an awareness that they were perhaps witnessing the overture to the ultimate destiny of man.
Lovell confirms ignition. And the thrust is okay, Booster says.
On board the spacecraft and in mission control, the men of Apollo 8 watched the readouts. Velocity buildup in feet per second. The numbers snowballing toward the velocity that would allow the spacecraft to escape Earth's gravity.
That NASA film from December of 1968 as we conclude our 9-part series here on C-SPAN and C-SPAN 3's American History TV. And joining us here in our studios in Washington, Mark Kramer. He is the project director for the Cold War Studies program at Harvard University. Thank you very much for being with us. And Elizabeth Cobbs, she is a professor at Texas A&M University, also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. I want to begin with you to talk about this intersection of what was happening in 1968. We had the escalation of the Vietnam War, the political turmoil with Lyndon Johnson announcing that he will not seek another term, in large part because of Vietnam, and the heightened tensions with the Cold War, and the Soviet expansion into Czechoslovakia.
Bad year. Yeah, no, it was a year where it seemed like all of these strands seemed to come together at once. North Korea became more, opportunistic, trying to actually, launch a kind of a situation where they might be able to open up a southern front, taking advantage of the Vietnam War and the Tet Offensive, and then Czechoslovakia, which was this, moment where, like so much of 1968, where it seemed like everything might change for the better. And then the Cold War comes in and slams it all down.
Explain what happened with the Soviet moving into Czechoslovakia and why that was such a significant milestone in 1968.
Well, in a way, Czechoslovakia had always been so important because it helped to start the Cold War. And the United States creates a Marshall Plan and a Truman Doctrine partly around what happened originally in Czechoslovakia after World War II. So then when Czechoslovakia seems to start a program of reform, lifting censorship, creating a more open government. And the Soviets come in and shut that down. And then what happens right after that is that Leonid Brezhnev, who is the head of the Soviet Union, announced what was called the Brezhnev Doctrine. And so by the end of the 1968, all this wonderful flowering of possibilities for greater dialogue and greater freedom have been decisively cut off. And Brezhnev said, we will intervene anytime any socialist government, meaning communist government, is threatened, militarily.
Mark Kramer, what was the domino theory?
That was the idea developed after World War II, that if one country fell to communism, that others might as well. And specifically in the case of Indochina, the concern was that if South Vietnam was overtaken by the communists in the north, that that Laos and Cambodia would soon follow. That doctrine was, or that notion was inspired in part by what had happened in Eastern Europe right after World War II, when various governments, mostly in Central and Eastern Europe, fell to communism. But in that case, it was through direct Soviet occupation. The concern in East Asia was that it might come about through indigenous guerrillas who would take over.
And who was funding the North Korean government at this time?
The North Koreans? The North Koreans were...
I'm sorry, North Vietnamese.
North Vietnamese was very heavily armed by both the Soviet Union and China. However, Soviet Union and China were bitterly at odds at that point. So they were competing with each other for greater influence in North Vietnam, and that worked out well for the North Vietnamese because they could play them off against each other and get more weaponry.
And I want to ask you about North Korea. Who was funding North Korea during this time? And explain what was happening and how that's relevant to what we're seeing today.
Well, what was in North Korea, they had, again, it's sort of playing both sides against the middle. They had patrons in the Soviet Union and in China, but at the same time, they were always doing their own thing. So, for example, they seized the USS Pueblo, which was an American ship.
What happened there?
Well, what happened there was that the Pueblo was on a spy mission, and it was in what we considered international waters, what most people consider international waters, beyond the 12-mile limit. And what happened in January of 1968 is that the North Koreans seized this American naval ship. And it was lightly armed, it was ill-prepared, and they were unable to fight off the submarine chasers and ultimately MiG fighters that went after the ship. And so, but the interesting thing about that is that neither the Chinese nor the Soviets were aware this was going to happen. And so this really, like today, was something that was instigated by the North Koreans. And they saw it as possibly an opportunity to start another war to, as they would say, liberate the South, meaning the South of Korea itself.
And politically, you mentioned Leonid Brezhnev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union. We have pictures of him much older in the 70s and early 80s when he was dealing with Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. But where was he politically in the Soviet Union in 1968?
Well, yeah, I mean, he had been a rising star for a long time within the Soviet Union. And so he's in this process of consolidating his own power. And so when he orders, for example, the invasion into Czechoslovakia, he's really, taking the reins of power and guiding the Soviet Union in the direction he wants.
Take us back to what you think President Johnson was thinking as he sent more troops to Vietnam and was looking at the broader picture of where the Soviet Union was and where the Cold War was heading, how that was a driving force in his Vietnam policy.
Well, the major buildup of U.S. forces had occurred just before 1968, starting in 1965, and at the height, U.S. forces reached about 525,000, which is an astounding number in a fairly small country. In 1968, after the Tet Offensive, which was a military victory for U.S. forces, but was a political disaster because it made clear that the Vietnamese communists had far greater strength and staying power than the U.S. government had been letting on, particularly Secretary of Defense McNamara. So it was a turning point in the war because until that time, there had been majority support diminishing, but still majority support in the United States for the war. Public support from then on never was majority again, and increasingly it turned against the war. So Johnson was consumed by that, and it led in short order to his decision in March not to seek re-election and also to begin de-escalating the war.
The Johnson White House putting together once-a-month films that really highlighted what he was doing. And this is from July 1968, as President Johnson traveling to Hawaii and meeting with the South Vietnamese president.
On July 18th, President Johnson arrived in Honolulu for a series of meetings with South Vietnam's President Nguyen Van Thieu.
At all of our meetings over the past 2.5 years, you have stressed your country's policy of reconciliation and peace. Since we met in Canberra last December, formal talks have begun in Paris. We devoutly hope that they are the first step on the difficult path to peace, an honorable peace under which the people of your country will determine their own future. Mr. President, our pledge to help your people defeat aggression stands firm against all obstacles and against any deception. We want you to take back to your countrymen our hope and our conviction that their courage and their faith will be rewarded with a just peace with full freedom.
President Johnson with the South Vietnamese president in July 1968. Mark Kramer, let's kind of set the stage for where the country was at, because we had the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Vice President Humphrey was about to be nominated the following month as the Democratic candidate. The Republicans nominating Richard Nixon, and Lyndon Johnson trying to bring a peaceful end to the war in Vietnam. Where was he politically? Where was his military? Where was his Defense Department in all of this?
Well, Johnson was deeply shaken not only by the assassination in June of Robert Kennedy, but 2 months earlier, the assassination of Martin Luther King. It was accompanied by civil violence in the United States that had begun in the mid-60s and had escalated in 1967 and 1968, including here in Washington, D.C. That meant that Johnson wanted to focus on domestic priorities, and that was always his major interest, but he was consumed from early on by the war in Vietnam. And that's why in his final year in office, he wanted to focus on whatever priorities he could do while trying to bring a peaceful end to the war. Now, Hubert Humphrey was initially not the favored candidate, but was certainly, after a while, put forth by Johnson as someone who could continue his programs and who would stand a reasonable chance against Richard Nixon. Johnson did not like Robert Kennedy. That was no secret, and he was uneasy. At the same time, was deeply saddened by Kennedy's assassination.
At the same time, while all of this was happening, the Apollo program continues to grow with research being done in Florida and Texas at Cape Canaveral and the Johnson Space Center. And Apollo 8 that we saw that video just a moment ago launched in December of 1968.
Yeah, I think the curious thing about the Cold War is that it always brought out the worst and the best in America. And part of that was a peaceful competition with the Soviet Union about space. It actually began in 1955 when the United States announced it was going to put a satellite up. The Soviets heard that and immediately got going. They launched the first satellite, which was Sputnik. And the joke in Washington and actually in foreign capitals at the time was that when Sputnik went over the world, it would go beep, beep, beep until it got over Washington. It would go ha, ha, ha. So this space race was a part of this whole thing, and the Soviets had not only beaten us to the first satellite, they had beaten us to the first man in space with Yuri Gagarin, and then also, again, they were beating us in 1968. In September, they had the first lunar orbit, but they had put up 2 turtles and some mealworms. So the United States at that moment decided it was going to have to change the mission of Apollo 8, which had been to orbit the Earth, and instead they decided to put men orbiting the moon. And so that's what Apollo 8's mission was.
And we were just looking at some really incredible pictures from NASA back in 1968, 50 years ago, as we look back, America in turmoil, and 3 key players, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders.
Right, and you know, I'm sure it must have been thrilling to them because they were supposed to go on this much more, you know, pedestrian kind of orbit of the United States, pardon me, of the world, and instead here they are, the first human beings to be in that part of space, you know, be orbiting the moon, and so it was this remarkable thing that on Christmas Eve they beamed back to the world, a message to everybody. And again, that's that thing where the Cold War, it's this kind of combination of who we want to be and who we're forced to be by these terrible circumstances. And in their message, you know, on Christmas Eve, they said, you know, goodwill to everyone.
We are dividing our phone lines a little bit differently. For those of you who are 50 and older, the number to call is 202-748-8001. And for those of you under the age of 50, 202-748-8000. What does 1968 mean to you, having lived through that?
I was a very small boy at that time. The major thing I remember about it directly was that Denny McLain, the pitcher for the Detroit Tigers, won 31 games. But I do remember the Kennedy assassination and the and certainly Martin Luther King's assassination vaguely because my parents were upset. But in retrospect, as a scholar, I have written extensively about 1968, particularly the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Prague Spring that preceded it. And it's that combination of things, as we've been discussing, the combination of the Vietnam War, the unrest in the United States, the apparent promise of major change in the communist world brought to a crushing end, the Pueblo incident with the North Koreans, the kind of despair that was there at the end of the year, despite Apollo 8 and the message, the upbeat message it conveyed, there still was a real sense that American society was not holding together well.
Elizabeth Cobbs, from your perspective, why was 1968 such a consequential year in American history?
I think it was a year of moral crisis. You know, all of the things that have been building since 1945, 1947, the start of the Cold War, it kind of all comes home. And the Cold War was a profound disjuncture from all the rest of American history that preceded it. This idea of taking responsibility for every major crisis around the world. And as I said, it pushed us to be our best selves. Civil rights, our discrimination in America was always delighted our enemies and was the despair of our friends. So, we'd been working on all these things, and I think that 1968 just was the culmination of that. Plus, that was true all around the world. And we forget there were major riots in Mexico City, there were major riots in Paris, Prague Spring. I mean, there were the Cultural Revolution in China. So it was a kind of turning point in world history that caught us all.
Why was peace so elusive for President Johnson that year?
It was mostly because of the Tet Offensive and the political effect it had in the United States, which was quite poisonous. So before long, it led to overt campaigns against the war on the part of leading Democratic candidates, Eugene McCarthy, but particularly Robert Kennedy, who tried to pick up that mantle. Martin Luther King, prior to his assassination, had come out explicitly against the war, which he had earlier avoided because he knew it would antagonize Johnson. And even though the two men had an uneasy relationship, they had worked together quite productively on civil rights issues. So the search for peace, though, what ultimately caused it to elude Johnson was simply that the North Vietnamese weren't interested in peace. They wanted to win on the battlefield. They were confident they could do it, and the Chinese in particular were encouraging them to do that. The Soviet Union was a different matter. The Soviet Union began to raise the question of peace overtures with the North Vietnamese, but the North Vietnamese weren't interested in listening to that either.
And we should point out these talks taking place in Paris, more from 1968 and at the Johnson White House.
On March 31st, President Johnson had ordered a bombing halt in all areas of North Vietnam except the immediate panhandle above the DMZ, an area through which massive numbers of infiltrators and their supplies of war continue to pour. As a result of this decision, the much-awaited truce talks with Hanoi began in Paris on May 13. During September, Ambassador Averell Harriman, President Johnson's chief negotiator at the talks, reported that after 4 months and a total of 21 formal sessions, there still had been no substantive discussions. The North Vietnamese negotiators clung to their long-held demand that all bombing must stop before they will discuss anything else. The President, in close counsel with his top military and foreign affairs advisors, repeatedly asked for assurances that Hanoi would reciprocate with some form of military de-escalation should the bombing be completely stopped. No such assurance was forthcoming.
That film again from the Johnson White House, going back to your earlier point, Mark Kramer, but Elizabeth Cobbs, simultaneously you had Richard Nixon, who had his own plan to get out of Vietnam, or did he?
Well, Nixon always promised he would get out of Vietnam, and we know now, I mean, the evidence is there, and archival evidence, that Nixon's made an effort to halt and to really foil Johnson's peace efforts in October of 1968 as a part of his campaign. And in many ways, some people feel this was worse than anything he did in Watergate, because he wanted, as was said, to put a monkey wrench in the efforts in late October because of the concern that maybe Johnson was getting close, that they could trade this bombing halt for a movement by the North Vietnamese. And we'll never know. Mark's completely right. And the North Vietnamese were absolutely determined. But, it's easy to paint those things in black and white. And if Johnson's program had been able to proceed without the South Vietnamese being told, don't compromise because you're going to get a better deal under Nixon, then who knows, something else might have happened. And it's a terrible tragedy, both for the United States and for Vietnam.
And of course, the war would not formally come to an end for another 7 years.
Yes,
in
it just went on, and another half of the Americans who died under Richard Nixon.
1968, America in Turmoil, and joining us here as we wrap up our 9-part series on C-SPAN and C-SPAN 3's American History TV, Mark Kramer from Harvard University and Elizabeth Cobbs from the Hoover Institution and Texas A&M University. Stuart is joining us from Mechanicsville, Virginia. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. I was born in I graduated high school in 1968 at the age of 17. I asked my father if he would sign for me. I wanted to join the Corps. And he told me in colorful language to remove my head from another part of my anatomy. I turned 18 in July, and I went down and signed up to join, but I failed the physical. I blew out a knee playing football that past fall. At any rate, the Army took me, but talking about the Cold War, I'll tell you what the Cold War was. The guys that did serve and came back, if you had short hair, you were shunned. I had one friend come to the airport in California, and somebody asked him, said, "How many babies did you kill?" He said, "I haven't killed one soul." He said, "But if you don't get it in my face, you will be the first."
Stuart, let me follow up on that point. I'll give our guests a chance to respond as well. But from your standpoint, why was that sentiment so prevalent in the late 1960s, early 1970s?
I don't know. I really don't. I mean, if you had a short haircut, good luck on trying to get a date. I mean, it was very difficult back in those years. It really was.
Thank you for the call. Well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I don't know why it was, but like I said, very small percentage served in the armed forces then, most people were either, in college or something. But, it was, I had one friend was with the tip of the spear. He was first out cavalry. He was only in theater 45 days. In 45 days, he was in 27 firefights. He was only 19 years old. I mean, think about it.
Rough times, and thank you for the Mother's Day wishes. I think that there was that moment where who you were as an American was something that people were questioning. It was, as I said, kind of a moral crisis, and there were some people who looked in the mirror and said, I don't like what I see when I see America today. And then it became this, test, was your hair long, did you have a beard? There was at one point early in the history of the Peace Corps where one of the Peace Corps volunteers had a beard, and the Peace Corps made him shave it because it looked too much like Fidel Castro. So there's this weird thing that happens where we become very attuned in a way to the fashions which seem to speak volumes and say things about who we're identifying with and who we don't. So they were terrible times, and for the young men who served, some of them endured incredible circumstances, terrible events.
We'll go to George next in Gainesville, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. I guess I wish everyone a happy Mother's Day also. I just want to ask Dr. Kramer, I'm a two-tour Vietnam vet, 71 years old. I grew up in Gainesville, Florida, and we lost 41 young soldiers from Alachua County in the Vietnam War. But my question, as I've come back and read a lot about the Vietnam era, is I took a trip back to Vietnam in 1998, and I was just, we flew into Hanoi, and I was going over there mainly just to kind of revisit some of the areas I had served. But what struck me was the way the Vietnamese people, the eagerness of them wanting to engage me in conversation, the young people wanting to get my email address. It just was amazing, the reception I got, and no one talked about the Vietnam War. And then just recently, a few months ago, we had a U.S. Navy carrier call on denying for the first time in 50 years. Here's my question to Dr. Kramer. I believe in a sense that we, as veterans that served over there, we were young. We were just happened to be the age of being drafted or being, I was in ROTC. I think we just happened to be the soldiers of that time, but I believe we did accomplish something in the sense that that last domino, maybe it fell, but Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, those countries did not. So my question, Dr. Kramer, do you see that maybe we who served did have some change, in a sense, the ending of the Cold War? That's my question, Dr. Kramer.
Thank you, George.
Okay, first of all, thank you for your service to the country, which I certainly appreciate. The outcome of the war can't just be judged by what happened in April 1975 with the fall of Saigon. It has to be looked at, as you put it, in a larger context. What would have happened if the South had fallen much sooner to the North Vietnamese and had been overwhelmed at a time when neighboring countries potentially could have fallen as well. The war achieved a good deal. There's no question, for example, that the South, which had a corrupt political system, but nonetheless was much more pluralistic than the totalitarian North, did advance, and that was largely because of U.S. push and the influence of U.S. troops. But still, I think overall, for whatever reason you can point to domestic backlash or other things, you do have to look at Vietnam ultimately as a failure for the United States, even if potentially it could have worked out more successfully. But there's no question, I agree with you, that There were important things achieved there. It among other things, made it deterred other guerrilla forces from contemplating launching that type of assault that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese had in Vietnam. So, again, ultimately a failure, but still with certain successes along the way.
Dr. Cobbs, a key element of the Cold War was the buildup of the nuclear stockpile. Let me put on the screen and tell our radio audience what the U.S. was facing back in 1968. You can see that we had more than 29,000 warheads. The Soviet Union had just over 9,000. Great Britain had 317, France 36, and China 35. And then beginning in the early 1970s with SALT I, SALT II, START, and the New START Treaty, you can see the decline in the nuclear stockpile, but still significant for the U.S. and Russia. Can you explain?
Well, the nuclear arms race, of course, had been going on since 1949, when the Soviets dropped their first bomb. And the oddity of it all was that, of course, this was a part of the logic known as mutual assured destruction. If you can kind of get enough bombs, then everybody's afraid to pull the trigger, and it created a kind of stability within the world. But it was mad. Mutual assured destruction was mad. And so there had, from the beginning, there had been talks about how to create a situation where, you could begin to draw back down. And so one of the big accomplishments of that period was the signing of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, an effort to bring back this kind of escalation that had been going on for such a long time. And by the way, it wasn't always the big countries who were leading in that. It was Ireland, which put forward the first proposal in the UN General Assembly back in 1961. So everybody was really affected by that. And that's, that's something that really we began to get a little bit of a hold on after 1968.
And you wrote a piece for the Washington Post, The 5 Myths of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. Who was the enemy? Who was our enemy during this period?
It was the Soviet bloc, but there were numerous enemies. The United States saw the Soviet Union ultimately as its chief enemy, but then, of course, there were smaller ones like North Vietnam and what became communist-controlled Vietnam, United Vietnam, North Korea, and certainly the People's Republic of China. In fact, in the 1960s, the PRC, the Chinese, had replaced the Soviet Union for a while as the being seen as the most hostile to the United States. But ultimately, until the late 80s, the Soviet Union was the overriding enemy for the United States from 1945, or at least the late 40s, until the end of the Cold War under Mikhail Gorbachev.
Our next caller is from Michigan. Ron, go ahead. Thank you for waiting.
Good morning. In 1968, I was 19 years old. I had a 4-year deferment for sheet metal apprenticeship. After I saw Walter Cronkite, I was against the war. I said it was time to go. I turned down my deferment. I volunteered to go to Vietnam. I volunteered to go to Vietnam. They wanted to send me to West Point Preparatory School, but I had to go to Vietnam. I had to work against the war. I saw the civil rights workers. I didn't have the courage. I had to have a gun and bombs if I was going to work against this government. While I was in transit to my station, I read Bernard Fall's autobiography, Ho Chi Minh. I learned my father, who spent 3 years in the Pacific fighting the Japanese, Uncle Ho, helped my father survive that war. I not only had to work against the war, but I had a debt to pay to the Vietnamese people for helping my father stay alive. I got every anti-war paper. I got the Black Panther Party papers. I passed them out to GIs. The biggest peace march ever held in Vietnam was held on the beach at Chu Lai. That's where I did most of my organizing. There was a fragging incident on my base. I reported it. I reported incidents. A year later, in the Americal Division, there was a fragging a week. The fragging itself was important, the reporting of it, and the spreading of the word through GI anti-war papers. That's what stopped the war. That's where Abrams said, I had to get this army out of Vietnam before it destroys itself. We were going to take over the military. That was my goal. You understand? I had no affiliations. I was just a working-class kid from Chicago. I saw the 68 conventions. I did not want to fight with the cops. I wanted to go to Vietnam to work against the war. I succeeded. We succeeded. We stopped the war. We stopped the draft. The GIs and the people in the streets, God bless them. When Kent State happened when I was in Vietnam, I was outraged. I was outraged, and Nixon was coming. I don't want to tell you what I would have done if Nixon came in my sights. It was a time. It was a time you had to be there. You know, and every GI I passed the paper out to, nobody refused it. I had them sign petitions.
Ron, I had to jump in because we can sense your emotion in your voice, and it's been 50 years.
Yeah, it has not stopped. You know, I had two sons. They did not go in the military. I have a 20-year-old son now. He's on a path to brilliance. I'm sorry to brag, but you know, I've instilled in him the same notion. He loves his country. I love my country. You understand? We do not want to see our country destroyed back then or now.
Let me jump in, and Mark Kramer will respond.
There's a big difference between first of all, I think the military is an honorable profession, and your sons should certainly be proud if they do serve in the military. That said, you know, there's a big difference between nowadays and the time you were there in 1968, in that there was military conscription in the United States, which had been against the grain of U.S. philosophy during most of the existence of the United States. So the shift to military conscription after the Second World War, and particularly after the Korean War, was a big change, and there was always uneasiness about it in American society. So in 1968, when young men were being conscripted into the United States, it helped to spur the domestic opposition, and it was one of the major factors in the growing unrest on U.S. campuses that caused this sense again that American society was coming apart, with civil unrest, violence in the streets, large-scale protests on U.S. campuses, the movement among some veterans as well as serving soldiers in Vietnam against the war. So all of that came together. That's why the United States over the last more than 45 years now has had an all-volunteer force, and that makes it very different today.
The culmination of the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the political turmoil here in the U.S., and the race for space. That's our focus as we conclude our 9-part series on 1968 American turmoil. We also have a Twitter poll. Nearly 26,000 of you already have weighed in, and the question is, did the U.S. win the space race? We hope you participate. You can join in by following us at C-SPAN History on Twitter. How would you answer that? Did we win?
I think we won. Kennedy said when he made his speech at Rice University saying we're going into space not because it's easy, but because it's hard. He said this is a challenge we intend to win. And in a sense, the U.S. it did. But on the other hand, that's the whole point of the Cold War. It's not like it was just a challenge of who gets to be king of the hill. It was, what is the world going to be like? Will the world be an association of peaceful states or not? So the other thing is, yes, we win. We got a man on the moon and the Soviets didn't. But ultimately, we shared a space station with them. So the larger goal that I think both countries always had of a more secure world where people don't have to send their children out to be slaughtered to protect the sovereignty of the nation was something that both countries were striving for, and I think that ultimately, we got together on it.
And this mission from Apollo 8 that we've been looking at really set the groundwork for Neil Armstrong, July 1969, to be the first man to walk on the moon.
Yes, and absolutely. Think of the difference. In January of 1967, not long before that, just the year before 68, Apollo 1 had exploded. The deaths of the 3 astronauts. So in that time, and think of the bravery of the men who did that, who went into those capsules knowing that that could happen to them. And in short order, the next year we had somebody in lunar orbit, and the next year we had 3 men on the moon.
Did the United States win the space race? That is our Twitter question. We hope you will add to those nearly 26,000 people who have weighed in. We'll go back to your phone calls. Bob in Canton, Georgia. Good morning.
Good morning. Having been born in the late 50s, I just remember growing up, and my childhood seemed to be traumatic. My father was a news, magazines, radio. He consumed information, and the information was flowing into our household. And all of the turmoil of the time is just seared into my mind, beginning with I was 4 or 5 when President Kennedy was killed, and then towards the latter part of the decade, the trauma, which I don't need to go into all of the matters that the country was dealing with. Further, I served in uniform under Reagan during the Cold War, and it's hard to explain to veterans and young guys in uniform now how the country was locked in this battle for control of the globe. And I know your guests don't want to get into current politics, but that's why it just boggles my mind how the current commander-in-chief enjoys the support of the military, many of which are old enough to remember the Cold War, and you know, his countenancing this gentleman who was part of the KGB during that time. During my time in office, this gentleman, there would have been talk amongst us of a firing squad. Thank you.
Bob, thanks. Who'd like to take that?
Okay, first of all, Bob, thank you for your service to the country in the 1980s. The major thing I would say is that the times have changed now. There are things that are feasible now that would have been inconceivable during the time the Cold War was underway. 1968, there was seeming progress, especially in the communist bloc. It came to a crushing end with the invasion of Czechoslovakia. The war in Vietnam had taken a very unfortunate turn. The North Koreans had seized the USS Pueblo, and so the Cold War was very vividly underway at that point. Nowadays, there are still major problems with numerous countries: Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, but they're of a different order compared to what was there in 1968 and during other years of the Cold War.
And the caller brought up what it was like here on the home front as we had the escalation of the Cold War and the rising concerns of Vietnam. This is from the Defense Department from that era, taking a look at how children especially should prepare for the possibility of a nuclear attack.
At the request of the Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization, the United States Army Chemical Corps has developed a mask especially for civilian use. This mask protects the wearer against biological and chemical attack by purifying the air inhaled. Filter pads in the mask absorb toxic gases and screen out radioactive dust and particles carried in the air. Particles which are called microbial organisms. The mask is comfortable, features good visibility and ease of breathing, and permits conversation with others.
That from the Defense Department, and also advising students to hide under their desk.
Right. You know, there was this apocalyptic sense, in our caller, you know, who was talking about this, I think, was right on the money, and that's what's hard to convey to people today, is how, and because of nuclear weapons, and the sense that, you know, I remember growing up thinking, okay, World War I, World War II, well, of course there's going to be 3, I can count, right? And so there was, I think, many people had the feeling that that would happen. What is so different today, though, and I think we so easily lose sight of, is that actually war between nations has declined every decade since the 1940s. And so the attempt to create a more harmonious world environment, believe it or not, has actually worked. And that caller was saying, you know, his dad was a newsman, so he was, in a sense, living the 24-hour news cycle at that time that we all live today. And that sometimes, I think, gives us this impression that things are much more apocalyptic than they actually are. Not to diminish current present-day dangers, but that's why history is so important to understand, you know, what's happened. As I said, you know, we actually cooperate with the Soviets in space now. So those elements of progress need to be appreciated and recognized.
Elizabeth Combs is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. She's also a professor of history at Texas A&M University and the author of how many books?
7.
And Mark Kramer, who is joining us here in Washington. He is the program director at Harvard's Project on the Cold War. David is next from Los Angeles. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, and again, happy Mother's Day to all of ladies listening in. And I would like to tie mine in with the assassinations as well as this Cold War and the military-industrial complex. Now, further as the Cold War is concerned in its beginning, after you mentioned the Marshall Plan. Now, here in the United States, we were at our peak of apartheid. And the only difference with South Africa and the United States is that our Mandela was assassinated. You know, there was someone who said that the United States of amnesia and the way in which we do history, it's like that period was America's zenith into its apartheid.
David, thanks for the call.
Let me take issue somewhat with that, David. The United States had been a deeply racist society, not only with a lengthy history with slavery, but then with 100 years odd with racial segregation and institutionalized racism in the United States. I think Lyndon Johnson, who in 1968 decided not to run for re-election, but he deserves immense credit for his instrumental role in getting past the civil rights legislation of 1964 and 1965, which I would largely agree with you. Until that time, you could argue the United States had a kind of apartheid system. But it came to an end, at least legally, at that point. There continued to be problems with racism and continue to be to this day. But I think you shouldn't underestimate the crucial role that Lyndon Johnson played. There might have been no other president who could have done that because he had the credibility as a Southerner, and he had the hugely positive relationship with various key figures in the U.S. Senate.
You know, I think the key difference, and in many ways I absolutely agree, in this height of segregation was, throughout the 20th century was terrible. But the critical difference between the U.S. and a country like South Africa is that the United States had a law, had an original, way of looking at itself, which was that all men are created equal. And even though it was Thomas Jefferson who wrote those words, an unrepentant slaveholder, that those words established a direction that was very hard ultimately for the country to resist. And that's what I think really allowed people, not only at the beginning of the country, but the 14th and 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, and then the laws that Lyndon Johnson, with of course, the groundswell that had been created by people like Martin Luther King, was able to bring to fruition. So it's kind of this weird thing. Yes, the ways that people acted were just as vicious and violent and cruel, but that law is what was like our guiding star, and thank goodness people like Johnson and King helped us get there.
Different countries, different time period, and different players, but under the category of learning from the lessons of history, with the Soviet Union and the Chinese government really propping up and supporting North Vietnam, are there lessons to what we're seeing in North Korea today with Russia and China?
I think absolutely. There's always this thing where the United States plays the bad cop, and so countries like China get to play the good cop. And it seems to me very important for us to be, putting more of the onus on those other countries, because actually they're the ones who've got a border with them. The Chinese, of course, are quite fearful that if things go belly up in North Korea, they're going to get all those North Koreans to take care of. And so whatever can be done to, push those countries to sort of call their bluff, because otherwise the United States is really left carrying the burden.
And also, I would agree. The thing, though, that's very different now, and it works in U.S. favor, is that basically Russia, China, and the United States have a lot of overlapping agreement about North Korea. That wasn't the case with North Vietnam. The interests of the Soviet Union and China, particularly China, were starkly at odds with those of the United States. So in this case, it's in some ways an easier issue to try to deal with, that there is greater room for negotiation that would be helped by the Russians and the Chinese.
By the way, if you're interested in this 9-part series, America in Turmoil, looking back at 1968, it's available as a podcast. You can check it out on our website at cspan.org or wherever you get your podcasts. Vicki is joining us from Twin Falls, Idaho. Go ahead, please.
Hi. Yeah, this period of time that you're talking about, I lived it. I was born in 1951. And a little while ago, the lady said that war has been on the decline. American soldiers have been dying for my whole life in some place in the world somewhere all the time. And the building of this international socialist system, I feel like I was deceived my whole life. Because while we're told we have a capitalist country here, we don't. We have a centrally planned economy. And this international socialist system that they're building, globalization they call it, they plan on ruling the world in what you could call tech fascism.
Response from either of you?
I'm an ardent supporter of globalization, so I might not be to your liking, but the United States in the aftermath of the Second World War set about fostering an international economic system that promoted open trade, open free trade, and it was immensely beneficial for the world. It led to huge increases in global income. It was certainly beneficial for the United States. That's why I regret that over the last year or so there have been attacks on that system. But still, the system of globalization, it shouldn't be described as international socialism. And quite the opposite. It was the spread of capitalist institutions to much of the world. China, in integrating itself later on into the international economic system, discarded some of the elements of its socialist economy. It still is a communist dictatorship, but it has increasingly taken on elements of capitalism. So it's the opposite, I think, of what you were describing.
Elizabeth Cobbs.
Yeah, I think that I would respectfully disagree with that too. Although I absolutely empathize with this worry, this concern that if for decades upon decades, your whole life, American soldiers have been dying in various places. And the interesting thing about that is that number has declined. So as bad as it is, that 24-hour news cycle, which keeps reminding us of all of the terrible things that are happening, tends to overlook the longer-term trend. And that trend has been made positive by globalization for the reason that before World War II, the idea was the only way a country could get ahead, or countries like the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany thought they had to take over other countries and absorb their resources to become more wealthy. And instead what's happened is that we've developed a world system where you can get ahead by trading peaceably with your neighbors. And that's a system, as Mark just pointed out, that the Vietnamese, the South Koreans, and also the Chinese communists have come to embrace because they see it actually works better. It's not that we won, in fact we lost in Vietnam. And the Chinese came to this on their own, largely because the United States always held to the idea that if we could provide a better model for the world, if we could be our best selves, that others peaceably would want to emulate that over time. And for the most part, they have.
Brian, thank you for waiting. Pottstown, Pennsylvania. You are next.
I hate to, quibble about something, but Apollo 1 didn't explode. It had a terrible
fire,
oxygen fire. And it might have been better for the 3 astronauts if it had exploded, because it was just it's hard to believe that NASA would think that they could keep 15 pounds per square inch of pure oxygen in that capsule and not have a problem if there was even a spark, and that's what killed those 3 astronauts.
Yes, you're absolutely right about that, and just using a quick word to describe it, but it was a terrible thing. And as you said, the use of pure oxygen. Also, they had flammable materials inside the capsule, and the door couldn't open from the inside to the out. So all these, mistakes that were then later corrected, but were a very, very sad event at the time.
And this illustrates the impact of the Cold War, because the Cold War was driving the space race much faster than it probably should have gone, because it led to the cutting of corners on some safety concerns. Now, ultimately, the number of the Apollo 1 type accidents was very small. So it worked out okay, but looking back on it, you have to be somewhat disconcerted to see how the Cold War sped up the space race and led to the carrying out of certain missions probably before they should have been. I mean, I'm very happy with the way it worked out overall, despite the loss of the 3 Apollo 1 astronauts, but it is illustrative of the way the Cold War caused both the United States and the Soviet Union to do certain things that they wouldn't have done otherwise.
Stephanie is next, Long Beach, California. Good morning.
Good morning to everyone, and happy Mother's Day. I was born in 1950, and I was just graduating high school in 1968. I skipped my prom so that I could go to Washington and demonstrate against the war. It was such a year. It was like everything happened so fast. You couldn't even recover from one event before the next event happened. And it was like you were constantly thinking, what happens next? And that nuclear threat that we were raised with since kindergarten, get under your desk or run home so that you can see your parents one last time. I mean, I think the hippies said, don't trust anyone over 30. We didn't even think we were going to get to 30. And it all happened so quickly. And then it all kind of just disappeared so quickly. And I mean, after the 70s and the war was finally over, it was just a different time and place again. One of the reasons why people were so against the war was that you could get drafted at 18, but you couldn't vote. So it was like these forces were so beyond your control that you were just being buffeted by these things. And then later I learned that communism, while it was a dirty word in the United States, really was an economic system more than it was a political system. And we were taught to be so frightened of it. And it was just a very hard time, I think, for everyone. And I think it's a very hard time for everyone now.
Stephanie, thank you. Elizabeth Cobbs.
Well, communism was meant to be an economic system, but it also really was a political system because it was associated with totalitarianism, beginning in the Soviet Union and every country which came under communist rule. And so that was always the kind of confusing thing about it, and I completely relate to what you're saying, because in many ways we thought, well, why should we care about someone else's economic system? But there was such brutality. The way that the Czech Prague Spring was crushed, the way that the Soviet Union rolled over its neighbors after World War II. And so I think one thing we forget is that, as you said, sometimes things seem to happen all at once. And I think that for a lot of the policymakers at that time, they had lived through the 6 weeks or 8 weeks in which Nazi Germany conquered all of Western Europe. And so the idea of a domino, it seems kind of silly to us now, like why would anybody care? But some of those threats were real. And but then, the solutions were not as clear. And I think we did make some important mistakes in trying to solve the problem. But there was a real issue that people were contending with.
And since you brought it up, and the callers as well, Apollo 1, the 3 astronauts who lost their lives. This is from Time magazine in 1967. And those astronauts, Grissom, White, and Chaffee, who died, but of course later leading to the Apollo 8 mission, and then Neil Armstrong, who successfully landed on the moon in July of 1969. Dave is joining us next from Mio, Michigan. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. And concerning this Cold War, Mr. Gorbachev sat across the table from George H.W. Bush and united the Germanys, gave the Warsaw Pact nations their independence. The Soviet Union was split up, and all Bush had to do to promise was to stay out of this business. But we Americans, the Miss Kravitzes of the world, violated that immediately with Bill Clinton in Kosovo. We just can't mind our own damn business.
Mark Kramer, does Dave have a point?
First of all, as Elizabeth has pointed out a couple of times, in the aftermath of the Cold War, from the late 80s on, there's been a steady, or pretty much steady, decline in the number of people killed in conflicts, the number of international conflicts going on. There's still civil wars, but still it has declined quite markedly. And that certainly includes Americans, despite the tragic number who lost their lives in Iraq and Afghanistan. It still is a tiny fraction of those who lost their lives in Vietnam. So it is true that the United States has had a propensity over the last 70-odd years of being a kind of global policeman. There is significant support for that role, even though there is also a very significant counter sentiment. And it is hard for U.S. presidents ultimately, when called on by other countries or when pushed by domestic forces, to refrain from somehow taking a leading role in the world.
Yeah, I think Madeleine Albright said it once. She said, "You're damned if you do and damned if you don't," as the United States, because there's an expectation that others have and that we've helped to create, that we will step in as, whether it's world policeman, a term I like to use, umpire. The United States is trying to umpire all these conflicts all the time. And I think what we're lacking still is a kind of leadership that will look beyond to the next 70 years. Because Mark is completely right. We've been doing this officially since 1947. But it's always been this odd thing where it's expected but not legitimate. Because it's not legitimated by international law. It's not legitimated by American law. And yet people expect it and demand it. And so it's a kind of conundrum that we've faced for a while. How do we get others to take more responsibility without being bad partners ourselves? Because we've created this wonderful, or helped to create a wonderful structure of world security. We need to appreciate that and sustain that. But one way of sustaining that is by developing good partners and making sure that we're not carrying this burden that has us, ricocheting from one issue to the next.
Another film in just a moment from the LBJ Library, as the Johnson White House chronicled his 5.5 years in the White House. We're going to see President Dwight Eisenhower. He left in January 1961. Did he have influence in American policy in the 1960s as a former president?
Eisenhower? Yes and no. I mean, I think that Eisenhower, we so remember, and I think some of our viewers have indicated this sort of, the military-industrial complex. When he left office, one of the things he did was to warn against the creation of the military-industrial complex. So I think those words echoed throughout this period of time, and he was seen as kind of a wise statesman in that respect.
I mean, certainly President Kennedy consulted with Eisenhower during the Cuban Missile Crisis. On the other hand, Kennedy had run against the then vice president under Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, and was harshly critical of the Eisenhower administration, including unfounded allegations of a missile gap. So there was not, I wouldn't say a very warm relationship between Kennedy and Eisenhower, and that continued under Johnson. There were always going to be consultations when important issues came up, including about Vietnam, but Eisenhower remained a more revered figure in American society and not so much of an influential political figure.
This excerpt is going to make reference to Czechoslovakia, and you have just returned from the Czech Republic?
Yes, I have. I was there about a year and a half ago, and I found myself stumbling because I kept wanting to say Czechoslovakia, which is no longer is. I mean, that's part of what's happened in this period of time where the number of countries has just multiplied. So yeah, I was in Czech Republic recently.
How were the Soviet troops received in Czechoslovakia?
I think with shock and dismay. The idea that you don't have control over your own country was a terrible thing. I mean, it's been seen in Hungary in 1956. So, again, people kind of hunker down and survive. And that's, that was the case in Eastern Europe, up and through 1989.
But there was a big difference. In 1956, Hungarian revolutionaries used violence against Soviet forces who came in. There were about 750 Soviet troops killed. There were about 2,500 Hungarians killed. In 1968, there was no violent resistance. Czechs and Slovaks were, as Elizabeth points out, were dismayed and shocked to find that Soviet and East European forces had come in to crush the Prague Spring, but they also knew that if they tried to resist violently, it would be mercilessly crushed. So there were about 100 people killed in the invasion, but there wasn't anything like the carnage in 1956.
So with that background, here is from the White House, 1968, the Johnson White House, in this film that includes former President Dwight Eisenhower.
At Walter Reed Army Hospital, former President Eisenhower suffered his 7th heart attack and went on the critical list in August. But the general had never taken kindly to defeat. And when President and Mrs. Johnson visited him at Walter Reed Hospital, they found that he had rallied and was in good spirits. As Allied commander in World War II, one of the countries General Eisenhower helped liberate was Czechoslovakia, pushing Nazi tyranny from its boundaries. But just 23 years later, the Central European Republic was again ravaged by the forces of aggression. On August 20th, armies of the Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and East Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, seizing control of the country in a few hours. Soviet embassy lights burned late that hot and muggy evening in Washington. Even as Russian tanks rumbled into Prague, Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin called White House Special Assistant Walt Rostow to present Moscow's official reason for the invasion. The memorandum, which said that Soviet bloc forces had acted at the request of Czech leaders to safeguard the country against subversive elements, sounded hollow indeed.
From the summer of 1968, and that courtesy of the Johnson Library and the Johnson White House. Back to your phone calls as we look back 50 years, 1968, America in turmoil. Deborah, Richmond, Virginia. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. Happy Mother's Day. It's always been unusual for me to think about how all the devastation that we have done all over the world, and we make it into something heroic. I never could understand that. America, the rest of the world did bomb America. America bombed the rest of the world. And it doesn't make any sense to try. We try to Europeanize everything, and it's wrong.
Elizabeth Cobbs.
Deborah, I completely understand what you're saying. And I know that that's the common belief, and there's a lot of evidence for it. But what we tend to not remember or not even really know is the extent to which other countries have asked for us for our protection. Sometimes when you look at what's happened and you say, gosh, why didn't they all just kick us out? If we've got bases all over around the world, why do we still have those bases? And we have those bases because those countries actually want us there. Most of the places where American soldiers serve abroad are South Korea, they're in Japan, they're in Britain, they're in Germany, etc., Italy. And if the United States was an empire, they could ask us to leave. And the crazy thing is, America isn't an empire because we would leave. In fact, France kicked us out in 1966, I think it was, 67. And what did the United States do? It left. The same was true of the Philippines. So because we live here, we're very aware of our own motivations. But if you travel abroad and you work some abroad, what you realize is that a lot of those folks want us there. They're also critical of it. Nobody likes to be dependent on somebody else. And so it's both critical and at the same time desired.
Mark Kramer, a key player that continues to come up, Dean Rusk. Who was he, and what influence did he have on the administration?
Dean Rusk had started out as Secretary of State under President Kennedy. He was one of the few holdovers who stayed throughout the Johnson administration. And there were others, the Secretary of Defense McNamara and others who had served under Kennedy, but very few of them stayed till the end, and that included McNamara, who left. Dean Rusk was someone who was a very capable figure, a Southerner like Johnson, and he had a very close relationship with Johnson and also with Walt Rostow, who became Johnson's national security advisor during this time in 1968. And that meant that Rusk, on the one hand, was certainly committed to the Vietnam War, wanted to help Johnson in that effort, but was also increasingly conscious, I think, that things weren't working out very well there. That didn't diminish his support for the war, but it did mean that he himself began to look for other issues, and he accomplished quite a bit, for example, in policy toward Western Europe, which, as Elizabeth mentioned, Charles de Gaulle and President of France had posed a direct challenge to the United States. And that required a great deal of finesse and diplomacy to try to mend those breaches and to try to keep NATO from falling apart. Dean Rusk was one of the major figures in trying to work that out. So even though Vietnam didn't work out well for him, he did have some other significant accomplishments.
And conversely, in North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, what motivated him? What drove him?
Well, Vietnam has this long history, 2,000 years of worrying about its independence. I mean, it had been conquered by China for 1,000 years, you know, had other periods where China came back and tried to conquer them again. So one thing I think as they always say, Vietnam is a country, not a war. And they were really passionate about reuniting that whole country. So I think that, and of course, he felt that the way to do that was through a communist system. But that longer term trend, my gosh, has been there throughout Vietnamese history. So definitely a communist, definitely a feeling that he was on the vanguard of world revolution. And of course, that's what also 1968 was about, was this feeling that world revolution was spreading everywhere. You know, from the PLO to the, you know, to other factions, you know, in other countries. And so Ho Chi Minh fed on that.
Elizabeth Cobbs from Texas A&M, Mark Kramer from Harvard, and Barry, you're next from Center Harbor, New Hampshire.
Sir, good morning. Happy Mother's Day, and thank you for C-SPAN. An earlier caller mentioned that he thought that the military people that are in power presently would remember how bad Vietnam was and some of our experiences and want to avoid war. But I remember I served in Germany at headquarters 7th Army from 1960 to 63. Took my discharge over there, and I became quite friendly as an enlisted person can become with an officer, with a Captain L.L. Baird. And a few days before I was discharged into the cold weather in Germany, he said to me, and he was trying to talk me into staying in, and I wish I had, he said, "Barry, Vietnam isn't much, but it's the only war we've got." So the lifers loved it, and I use the term lifer not derisively, because 12 years later I went back in the reserves and the Guard and finished out my 20 years. So I loved the Army, but sometimes people forget that Eisenhower would have retired as a lieutenant colonel had it not been for World War II. And everyone in the military, they may say, like the Air Force likes to say, peace is our profession, but secretly they yearn for a chance for advancement, and it's understandable. So, you know, and we now have what Washington advised us to avoid, which is a standing military. And we've created a military caste both on the enlisted side and the officer side, and I don't think it bodes well for the country in many ways. I recall that you know, I think it was beneficial to see the Southern boys, the rednecks who claimed they'll never integrate Ole Miss, in the morning have to take orders from a black NCO from Harlem.
Barry, I'm going to jump in because I know our guests want to weigh in, and this is something you brought up earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're absolutely right. The United States was the world's largest neutral nation for the first basically 150 years of its existence, and then made a fairly conscious and actually very deliberate decision that was debated in Congress openly in 1947 as to whether or not to take on this bigger role between the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, kind of the military part of this and the financial part of helping to promote world peace. And it was really to our advantage. It was to the advantage of everybody that happened. But what has happened since is this sort of logic has remained more or less unquestioned. And no system works forever. It's always good to plan for what comes next. And I think you're right. We have this industrial complex that's that's problematic for the United States, and that has led us down roads that are not always good roads to be going down. So I think that you make a very, very important point.
Mark Kramer, one of the major achievements for President Johnson was the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. What was that?
The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty had been under discussion for several years. Initially, mostly between the United States and the Soviet Union, but increasingly, as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, there were much smaller countries, Ireland and India. Well, India is not smaller, but still, yeah, less consequential.
In terms of weapons capability.
Right, less consequential actor in the global scene. And they had been pushing this for a long time. So the treaty, though, was ultimately a way of trying to deal with the German question, short of an outright settlement of Second World War, because that wasn't resolved. The status of Germany wasn't really resolved until 1990. But there were important agreements achieved in the early 70s, but one major step toward all of that was the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that's why it was crucial for both the United States and the Soviet Union to ensure that West Germany would be a part of it. And the Germans were hesitant about it, but ultimately certainly agreed to sign on. And so the Non-Proliferation Treaty was an attempt to contain the horizontal proliferation of nuclear weapons, the spread from to other countries. And actually, again, the treaty isn't ultimately what has limited that spread, but it has certainly provided an international political framework that makes it easier for countries to do that. And at the time the treaty was signed, there were already 5 nuclear powers. Nowadays, depending on how you count, if you want to still count a country like South Africa, even though it gave up its nuclear weapons, but there has been very little spread of nuclear weapons since that time, and the Non-Proliferation Treaty has set the framework for that, even if ultimately it's larger security concerns that have contained that spread.
And from that ceremony, 50 years ago, the signing ceremony for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
On the morning of July 1st, in parallel ceremonies in Washington, London, and Moscow, representatives of 57 nations affixed their signatures to one of the most significant and meaningful documents of the 20th century, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
This treaty is not the work of any one country, but is in fact the product of all nations which shared our concerns over the danger of nuclear proliferation. Agreement has not been easy, where basic security, the technological and economic interests of so many nations are deeply involved. Yet our collective and persistent determination has today been crowned with success.
Today we are here to add another stone to the edifice which one day we all pray will ensure lasting peace to mankind through complete and general disarmament.
From July 1968, Elizabeth Cobbs?
I would just add that I think that, we just saw LBJ in that clip, and I think Mark was so right to point out that because of what happened in Vietnam, we tend to remember LBJ in that way. But here was a person who did so many other things as well, advanced civil rights in a way that no president had done since Abraham Lincoln, advanced the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Those were really major accomplishments that changed our world.
Charlie is joining us from Herkimer, New York. Good morning. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. In the late 1970s, I was assigned to the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, and our mission was we guarded the border between East, West Germany, and Czechoslovakia. And a couple of 100 feet into Czechoslovakia, there was an apple tree. And I was there picking apples. I was walking back to our lines. I heard movement behind me. It was an 8-man Czech Army patrol, and all they did was they smiled and they waved. In the morning, we would give them hot coffee. They would give us hot soup. We got along very well with the soldiers of the Czech Army.
Yeah, I mean, one of the results of the invasion of Czechoslovakia was that the Czechoslovak army, which had been a very capable one up until that time, was not allowed to resist, and that led to a widespread demoralization in the army, and subsequently there was a major purge in the army as well, because it too had been affected by the reformist sentiment of the Prague Spring, and so all of those people were removed, and the Czechoslovak army over the next 20 years or so was a pretty ineffective force.
And these are some of the images from that period in 1968. Are they still visible today in the Czech Republic?
I think the Czech Republic looks completely different today. It's just a beautiful pastoral place with music on every street corner. But you know, if you talk to people of a certain age, I mean, they will remind you, of how terrible it was. And I think there is such a different feeling in Western Europe from Eastern Europe in terms of how they saw the U.S. role in the Cold War. I mean, we, like Western Europeans, tend to be very self-critical of our role in the Cold War, and the Eastern Europeans have a very different attitude. They were, they felt left behind, and they also felt that the United States was one of the few countries which continuously was at least expressing a desire, for them to become free.
Mark Kramer, another key player, of course, is Chinese leader Mao.
That China had been plunged by Mao into the Cultural Revolution in 1966, and that was a very harsh time for China. There had been millions who died in starvation of famines caused by Mao's policies in the late 50s and early 60s. But what happened in the Cultural Revolution in some ways was even more traumatic for Chinese society. Even though there were fewer people who died, it was still vast numbers, and it was in the most grisly way, often through ritual torture and through humiliation of people needlessly. University campuses, for example, were occupied by people who would then force professors out into, which would affect Elizabeth and me, to out into the open, and they would be degraded and often beaten violently and sometimes killed. So it was an extremely violent and chaotic event in China, and Mao was very much at the center of that. Mao at this time was aging. He was already by this point in his late 70s, and he seemed to look on the Cultural Revolution as a way to rejuvenate that revolutionary spirit that he had instituted in China when he came to power with the communists in 1949.
Elizabeth Cobbs, this building behind us, the U.S. Capitol, did 1968 change Congress?
The riots came to Washington, D.C. itself. And so, I mean, I think that what you had was this, extraordinary turmoil within the Capitol. And of course, President Nixon was elected in 1968. It was just a terribly tumultuous time.
From your standpoint?
Similarly, in the case of Washington, D.C., there was violence on the streets. There were protests against the Vietnam War, but also protests, that were sparked here in the aftermath of Martin Luther King's assassination. There was, for people who lived through those events, they often remember, as one of the callers mentioned, this rapid chain of events, and it seemed that one thing would ease and then suddenly a new crisis would develop.
But the great difference is that we're sitting here talking about it. I happened to be in China 2 weeks ago, and there the Great Leap Forward famine is described as a time when China was just trying to repay Russia back for its help to China, and so that's where all the food went. Or I was talking with someone else who said, we never saw that picture of the young man standing in front of a tank in Tiananmen Square. So this question about whether communism is an economic system or a political system, I think, is complicated by the fact that really what you still have in so many of those countries, in a place like China, is a system that's so authoritarian, that you can't have the protests that we had here that were traumatic in Washington, D.C. in 1968. But we came back for them, and we didn't mow down our people, to stop their protest.
We'll go to Richard joining us from Missouri. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I'm say 80 years old, so I know about the Cold War. In 1960, I was going to be drafted, so I joined the National Guard. So nobody wanted to be in the Guards. So you had to go to a meeting every Monday night, see? So anyway, in 66, I got out. Time, everybody wanted to get in the Guards to keep from being drafted. So I was happened to be in construction business, so we went into building ammunition boxes for Vietnam War, built 1 million of them for 105 howitzers and 81 millimeters. But also, 1968, I had truck drivers going through Memphis whenever Martin Luther King was assassinated. That was trying times. But the real thing about Johnson, everybody don't like him, but anybody over 65 ought to like him because that's when he signed Medicare in. I'll let you go, man.
Richard, thank you. A real dichotomy between the foreign policy approach and the domestic policy by the Johnson White House.
I remember the first time when I walked into the LBJ library, and I came in as a person who, I remember the Vietnam War, and, I had protested against it myself. And so, I had this idea, Johnson, how many kids did you kill today, as one of our viewers was saying earlier. And yet, the fact is that once you walk in there and you start to realize everything else that this man did, that the barrel he was over, in a way, when it came to foreign policy. Because we forget, there were 5 Vietnam War presidents. Truman got us really engaged in Vietnam. Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. And so this Cold War logic, the sense that we had at all costs, to maintain this, pushback against the spread of communism, really trapped people. And what's so interesting, fascinating about Johnson, I'm so glad this viewer mentioned this, is that he brought us Medicare. He created a social security system that allowed people to have a living support. So, very complex man.
The year began with the Tet Offensive and escalated with political violence and assassinations, and it ended with this photograph in December of 1968 as we view planet Earth from space. And I want to share with you as we conclude this program the words of Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders. They were on board the Apollo 8 mission on Christmas Eve, 1968.
God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness.
The vast loneliness up here on the moon is awe-inspiring, and it makes you realize just what you have back there on Earth. The Earth from here is a grand oasis in the big vastness of space.
Give us, O God, the vision which can see thy love in the world in spite of human failure. Give us the faith to trust the goodness in spite of our ignorance and weakness. Give us the knowledge that we may continue to pray with understanding hearts. And show us what each one of us can do to set forward the coming of the day of universal peace. Amen.
That Apollo 8 mission, Christmas Eve, 1968. Mark Kramer.
The Apollo program itself had begun on a tragic note. By the end of 1968, it was pretty clear that it was going to lead in the near future to the landing of astronauts on the moon, as indeed it did in July 1969. So Apollo was a fitting way to try to bring out the contradictions and conflicts of 1968, because it itself had had those contradictions within it. And so the major achievements of 1968, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the saving of NATO through the Harmel Report and the subsequent steps taken by Secretary of State Rusk, were conflicted by again the grim situation in the Vietnam War and with North Korea.
And Elizabeth Cobb's Frank Borman relaying a lot of telegrams that he'd received, but the one that stood out the most, he said, from an American citizen, "Congratulations to the crew of Apollo 8. You saved 1968."
Yeah, I think that the Cold War pushed America to examine itself and to try to define what it was for, not just what it was against. And Apollo 8 was sort of, and what they said was, here's perspective on our world. Here is our Earth. And I think the last words of their phrase was, goodwill, Merry Christmas or something, to the good Earth, the good Earth. And in a sense, that's what they're trying to say, is that we're all on this fragile little planet together, and we need to work together.
And that concludes our 9-part series. We want to thank Elizabeth Cobbs from Texas A&M and the Hoover Institution, and Mark Kramer from Harvard. To you and all of the guests who have participated in the series, we thank you.